Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Introducing Pivot Views webinar. Thank you all for making some time for us today. I am Jenny Beer, and I am a solution consultant here at TrackVia. And just as a reminder, as we're getting started, you guys are all on mute. So if you have a question, please type it into the comments box there. Because if you're saying it out loud, you are talking to yourself. We won't hear you. But we do want to hear your questions, so please do put them in, and we will make sure we have time to answer those questions at the end. And just a reminder, we are recording this as well, so we'll be sending this out tomorrow, but you'll have a chance to review it if you would like to. So I am joined today by Anchal Kumar. He is the Senior Product Manager here at TrackVia. Anchal, say hi.
Hey, everyone. How's it going?
So for today, we have just a quick agenda here. Anchal is going to cover some introductory information about pivot views, and then we will look at an example of a completed pivot view in TrackVia so you can apply all of the history and the technical information to an example, and then we'll create something together so you can see all those options. And then we'll wrap it up with some tips and tricks and your Q&A. So Anchal is going to kick us off with what are pivot views?
Awesome. I'm going to actually start with a question. Jenny, when was the first time you ever heard about pivot views or pivot tables?
I heard about pivot tables in Excel.
Exactly. I think most of us who have ever used a pivot would know them from Excel. Pivots actually have been around for a really long time. And back in the day before computers, people would do these by hand. And then some of you might remember Lotus Notes. Lotus was the first company to actually do a software implementation of pivots, and they called it Lotus Improv, and they came out way back in 1991. So might be aging myself a little bit there, but then Microsoft came out with their pivot tables in 1993, and then they've been sort of iterating and building upon it for a really long time. So, but for us here at TrackVia, we think about pivots as a new type of view. Right? We're thinking about how can we help you, our customers, look into and analyze the data that you have in our system. We think about pivots as being multi-dimensional aggregate views, and that's like a total mouthful. So let's take a look at what that actually means. So first and foremost, it's a view. Just like you have grid views and map views and lane views and timeline and calendar views and all the different types of views in TrackVia, it's another way of looking at your data that you have in the system. So pivot views are created by converting an existing grid view, whether that's a default view or a custom view, into a pivot. So we're taking all of that data that you might have contained in that flat grid view and helping turn it on its head and help highlight and aggregate that data in new and interesting ways. Next, we think about how we aggregate the data. So when we talk about aggregate, we mean total or combination calculated by many separate items, right? And so what we're able to do is we're able to sum up or calculate in different ways the data that you have there. And so in TrackVia, we're following a paradigm that we have for our summary views today. And so there's 6 different aggregate functions that you're going to be able to use with pivots. And that includes count, count distinct, sum, average, min, or max. And so you'll be able to take that data and be able to apply one of these aggregate functions to it. Your pivot is going to be able to draw some attention to some of that key data that you have in the system, right? By aggregating that data together, you can quickly see where your highlights are. And last but not least, multi-dimensional. So today, TrackVia offers summary views, and I'm sure many of you have used those. However, summary views are single dimensions, right? You can select one field to be your aggregate, and you can summarize your data kind of, more or less on one axis. But pivot views now give you the power to look at your data using multiple dimensions, right? So the x-axis and the y-axis. So you can compare data from one field against another field. And even in this example that we're looking at here, we've got location and date, right? And so we can see the total revenue associated to each of our locations, as well as a date and a date roll-up that Jenny's going to talk a little bit more about along the top there. And so you can also add additional data points to further segment your data. So again, in this example, we've got location, we've added in an additional field. to be able to showcase whether or not that sale occurred to a rewards member. Awesome. Jenny?
Yeah, so now that we've talked about some of the different elements that define a pivot view, we're going to take a look at an example and then make one so you can really see those in action. All right, so here we are in TrackVia, and we are looking at an example of a project tracking application built out by the solution consulting team here. So we have built out in TrackVia a bunch of different applications around common customer use cases that we hear. So this is one example of how TrackVia might be applied to a project tracking need. So just to set the story for what our pivot view will be covering, we're here on a project portfolio dashboard. So on this dashboard, directors can add a new project and assign them projects to a project manager down here in the lanes view. That project manager would then log into the projects tab to be able to assign different tasks for those projects out to their various team members. Those team members log into the My Tasks dashboard to be able to see the start and due dates of those tasks and to record their progress. And then finally on the project analytics dashboard is where we find our pivot table. So this dashboard has a variety of different charts and metrics to show project performance for number of projects initiated, the schedule, how long things are taking, and also for revenue. So that's what our pivot view is showing here. We have our quarterly revenue on a rolling 2-year basis. So across the top, we have our project start dates rolled up into quarters. And then we have on the other side our project managers, and then it's further broken out by the project type. So we can see all of the revenue for, like, Brandon Gill here did about $600,000 worth of revenue in Q1 of 2018. So this pivot view would be useful if I was wanting to see maybe certain project types or project managers who were performing well and bringing in a lot of revenue, or maybe, you know, if we had some low quarters. And we have some conditional formatting applied as well. So you can see anything below $5,000 is red, and anything between 10 and 5 is here in yellow. And these pivot views, this is an example of a pivot view being embedded on a dashboard, but we can still, you know, collapse some of this information to just view the subtotals if you want. So you can still interact with this pivot view even when it's embedded on a dashboard like this. So to really see some of the options, we're going to build a new pivot view together. So I'm going to go up to this admin toolbar, and I'm going to go to views, and I'm going to go to a view on my projects table because that's where that summary information is. And I'm going to go down to this revenue summary view. So this is a grid view that I've already made that has all of the information relevant to my project revenue. And to convert it into a pivot view, I'm going to go up here to the options menu, and I'm going to scroll all the way down to pivot. So here I get to set up my pivot, and I am going to give my pivot view a new name. And I'm going to say annual revenue by stage and type. And then you'll see I have the choice. I can include an underlying grid view as well as my pivot. I mean, if I have both of them, I can choose which one will be the default. And then I can add all the information or select the information that's going to create my pivot view. So because I still want to roll up information by customer, I'm going to choose customer project first. And then I can choose the order by, and I will choose ascending to have this in alphabetical order. And then I can choose a subcategory if I want, which in this case, I want to see my revenue by project stage. And I'm going to leave the order by as none because my stages represent chronological order, so I don't want to mess with that. I want to keep that. And then I'll choose the columns. So because I want to roll this up annually, I'm going to choose the start date first. And then because I've selected a date field, I have a choice for how I want to roll up my dates. And so because I want annual, I'm going to go ahead and go all the way down to year. And then for the last subdivision, I also want to choose project type. So I want to see if that annual revenue is any different for the various kinds of projects that we have. And then finally, for the aggregate value, I'm going to choose revenue. And then I have those different summary options that Anchal mentioned earlier. So I'm going to choose sum in this case.
You'll notice that certain fields will, as you start using it, will have different options available to you. So for example, if you're using a number field or a percentage or a currency field, you'll have all 6 options available to you. If you're using a text field, however, you'll probably only see count or count distinct, right? Because it's kind of hard to sum or average some text.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to save my settings, and then you will see that we have created our pivot view. So like the previous example we looked at, I have the option for collapsing over here on the rows so that I can see subtotals or all of the detail. And then because I selected 2 options in the column choices, I can also collapse by the year. So then I could just see annual totals. So we have a pretty good start here for our basic grid view. And now Anchal is going to talk about some of the other options that you have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jenny. This is a great pivot. So let's see what else we can do with this. So Jenny mentioned already collapsing. If you'll notice that if we collapsed Honda, for example, you'll get your subtotals for Honda across all project types or project stages, right? We can actually include that without having to collapse it as well. And so we have a couple of options in our pivot designer, right? So we have show grand totals and show subtotals. And so basically what this means is for the primary field that you include, or the first field you include as rows or columns, you'll have this new show grand totals option. And this option gives you the ability to include the grand totals at the end of the row or the ends of the columns to sum up the total amount that you might have in that particular row or column. So if we added it for rows and we hit save settings, you'll notice it sums up all the rows top to bottom at the very bottom down here, right? We can also include the subtotals, right? So if we show the subtotals, we want to see for project stages what the subtotals are at each of the customer projects here. So we'll go ahead and save settings. And you'll see then we have the subtotals, right? So for Honda, at each stage, we've got all these different subtotals, right? Hyundai, Toyota, etc. We can go ahead and toggle that on for the columns to see it at the end of the columns and the project type. So you'll notice when we include project type, we'll include a new subtotal column within each of the top level fields, right? So our top level field is project start date, and we grouped it by year. And so we'll see the 2017 total as a new column included as part of the overall pivot itself. One of the additional things that Jenny had mentioned earlier was this toggle between the underlying grid view and the pivot. And so you remember we started with a grid view that was called, I believe, revenue summary, right? So if we clicked on grid, this would actually be that revenue summary grid. We renamed it to annual revenue by stage and type. However, this is the underlying data that we started the pivot with. And we can easily toggle back to the pivot itself. So as part of the initial example we saw some conditional formatting. Let's take a look at how we can actually build that out. So we go back to our options menu. Conditional formatting works just like our other views. When we go, we can select conditional formatting right here, and then this brings us pop over where we can add some rules. So we'll go ahead and add a rule. And here we have a new set of options here. We thought that you'd want to be able to apply separate rules to your underlying grid view versus your pivot. And so you have the ability to do so. So we want to apply a conditional formatting rule to our pivot view. We have in here the option to select which field we want to highlight. And so these are the aggregate fields, right? We don't really care about necessarily highlighting the column headers or the row headers, but we want to highlight the data that's contained, right? So if you had multiple values, you'd see those fields contained here. So select the project revenue, we can decide, oh, we want to highlight this in maybe blue, and then we can apply a condition. So we'll select when condition is true, and then we'll say when the project revenue is greater than 400,000, we can apply our rule and save it. Our pivot will reload, and then we'll see all those places where the project revenue was highlighted as greater than $400,000, right? And so in Jenny's example earlier, we could set a rule that was less than $5,000 or between $5,000 and $10,000. There's a lot of different types of rules you can create. So one thing you'll also notice is that we're presently highlighting both at the totals as well as the aggregate values in this.
So Anchal, now that we're paying more attention to the values, I see one row there that is only $123 and it says it's empty.
Yeah.
So that looks like an outlier. What
Totally.
do you think is happening there?
That probably means that we have identified a place where we might have some missing data. And so let's click on that. So if you do a single click on a value, you get this nice little popover that gives you some information about it. So we see that, okay, so the customer project was Toyota. Oh, and the project stage was empty. Something's going on there. Start date was in 2018, and the customer project type was a customer feature request. We can double click on this value and drill into the record itself. And so this then can show us that, okay, hey, we're missing a project stage. Let's go ahead and say that that is complete. And then we can go back to our pivot, and you'll see that that empty record is no longer there, and complete for 2018 and is now been updated from 25,000 to 123.
Perfect.
Awesome. Last but not least, we have some fun export stuff. So as many of you know, when you want to export a view in TrackVia, vast majority of the time you hit export, you're going to get a CSV of all of your underlying record data. With pivots, you can certainly do that as well. But if you click on export, you actually have a few new options. And this is exclusive to our new pivots feature, but you can always get that CSV of all your underlying record data. We also now include an XLS of your pivot data, so that's all of the aggregate data here, or a PDF of that pivot data as well. And so this is it. If you select XLS or PDF, you get the aggregates, you don't get the underlying record data, but you can certainly do that or pull that in by grabbing the CSV as well. And so let's see how this works. So if we want to maybe select a PDF, it downloads the PDF here. Let's open it up a little bit. And we'll see our PDF has been created, and it includes the conditional formatting. That's pretty neat. So easily shareable with this document type. And then last but not least, one thing I want to point out were a couple of things. One, you can increase the column width or decrease the column width on individual column headers you might want. You can also resort each of the column headers, right? So if you clicked on customer feature request, you would see that sort now being applied. And so what you can see here is that the sort applies both at the top level, so for customer projects, right? So you'll see Toyota at 237, Honda at 196, Hyundai at 60, etc. And then also within the columns themselves. So let's see if we can grab an example with a little bit more data here. So we'll see 240, 195, 40, and then within the columns for project stage, we'll see complete at 201, ready for review at 25, and on hold at 14. Awesome. So let's talk a little about some additional tips and tricks. So as we saw with that $123 record, pivots are great for identifying places where you might have some incomplete data or some data that's unexpected. So you can certainly drill into those records and be able to identify which of those need to be addressed. We also encourage you to play around with your data. And one of the things that we designed as part of this feature is this easy opening drawer, right? So whether you select this drawer right here, or you can also go to the options menu and just select the pivots. Again, it'll open the drawer. You can swap things out. You say, oh, I actually don't really need the project type, or I'd like to average the values. Let me save my settings. You very quickly and easily remove data, add data, change data, etc. for your pivot. As Jenny mentioned earlier, pivot views can be included on dashboards or as child views. So it works just like any other view type that can be included as a child view. So feel free to include these on your analytics dashboards or in forms where you need to, etc. And pivots also follow our roles and permissions paradigm. So app admins and super admins have the ability to change the configuration of a pivot, right? So you can go in and edit what is included in that pivot. However, your limited users would not be able to change that. The limited users have some functionality where they can, change the column width or resort it, etc. When they come back to that view, those things won't be saved at this time. but they certainly have the opportunity to be able to play around with the data a little bit. They just can't change what fields are included in the pivot and what aggregate functions you're using for that pivot.
Can the limited user still double-click in and see all the underlying information?
Absolutely. So if you're a limited user, you can still single-click to get your tooltip and double-click to drill into your records.
Perfect.
And if you're a limited user, you can also toggle between the pivot and grid if you as an admin have so included that option for them. And similarly, if you as an admin have included export capabilities to your limited users, they would also be able to export that data just as we showed earlier. All right.
Is there any limit to how much data you can include in a pivot view?
Thank you for asking me that, Jenny. That's absolutely, there actually are a few limits. So we have shown that you can get lots of different aggregates here. There are a couple of limits that I did want to mention. So when we look at this, we see a lot of cells. So we think of each one of these individual boxes as a cell, and we see lots of data points here. We do have some limits on the number of cells that can be included in your pivot and the number of data points. And so those limits are, you can have up to 10,000 of these boxes, right, whether there's a data point in it or not, and you can have up to 2,500 data points, right, so one of these aggregate data points. And the reason there's some limits is that we all are using different computers with different browsers, and each browser computer combination can handle only so much data or so many elements within the web browser itself, right? And that's just a function of how web browsers work today. And so if you get to a certain point, your pivot's going to be relatively unusable, right? It'll be hard for you to scroll and see your data. So that's why those limits exist. We also think that if you have 2,500 data points or if you have 10,000 cells, it's going to be really hard to see your pivot and understand what's on there and be able to get a lot of meaning out of that aggregate data you have, right? Because you probably are looking at individual data points versus aggregate data points. If you do find yourself running into those limits quite a bit, I would love to hear from you because I'd love to be able to have that conversation about, what is your use case and, how are you using those pivots? So please let us know. Reach out to our awesome support team or talk to your success rep or account exec, and we'll certainly get in contact.
All right, I think that wraps up all of the information we wanted to share with you today. So now we will take a look at some of the questions that have been submitted.
Okay, we've got a question about mobile. So pivots will display as a flat grid view today on mobile. When we want to get this product out, we didn't have a super strong mobile use case because we think most of our end users are probably limited users and aren't probably doing a whole lot of data analysis on mobile. However, if you've got a use case for a pivot on mobile, we would absolutely love to hear from you. So please definitely let us know. Hit us up by our support or success or account teams, and our mobile product team will definitely get in touch with you to have that conversation.
I see another question was about, can you only use pivots for revenues? And that is a good question. Two of the examples we showed you were about revenue, but no, you can use pivot for any of your aggregate data. So you could look at that, like we could have looked at maybe the number of tasks that were overdue or in each stage. So you can certainly use this for other information than just revenue.
So if we went to project type, for example, we could count the values, we'll save it. And so we can see then for project type, right, we can see that, okay, Honda has a total of 17 projects and they have 17 incomplete. For 2018, they've got 9 incomplete, 1 in ready for view, 2 in live, etc.
So you can certainly use this for whatever metrics are important for you, and you can play around to really be able to find the trends that illuminate some new information in your data.
Yep. So I see a question about filters around the underlying grid table. So yes, view filters still do apply to the pivot. So for example, if you take a view you have, you create a filter for it, and by filter I mean view level filter, and then you create your pivot off of that. the pivot would represent the filtered data that you've created for that view itself.
So similarly, there's a question about like if you wanted to just show the live row in the example that we're looking at, you would want to apply that filter on your grid view, and then you'd be able to have that filter applied to your pivot view that we're looking at here.
Let's see. So is there a way to hide certain rows? Not right now. Right now, if there is data for a field that you've included, so for example, in Ready for Review, for example, maybe you didn't want to include that for some reason or not, we don't have the ability to hide this, right, if it's included as part of your overall data set. You may be able to filter that out by creating a view level filter and saying, I want to see, by project or by customer, the different project types. I don't want to see any Ready for Review. You may be able to filter that out with a view level filter, and that's your data set that you create. You're creating the pivot off of won't include that data, but you can't from the pivot itself like select the row and hide it.
Which is similar to another question. Can we limit the number of rows to be selected so that you don't hit that limit? It's kind of the same idea. You just want to impose those filters on the view level. You can't in the pivot say only look at the first 100 rows or something like that.
Right.
You would need to be doing that filter on the view first. There's also a question about can I make a chart out of my pivot data or out of my pivot view? And at the moment, that is not a capability. So the pivot is sort of its own chart. Certainly, once you apply conditional formatting, you can really highlight some trends as well. But you can't make a separate chart out of that pivoted view.
And then sorting or filtering your pivot data. So we talked a little bit about view level filters being able to be applied for your pivot. We don't really have quick filters right now. So if you're on a grid view today, you can kind of hit the filter button that's on that grid view and be able to quickly filter your data. So we don't have that today, but you can apply those view level filters. And you can also, as you saw, sort your data. So you can apply either sort in the pivot designer, or if you click on that column header, you can resort your data based on what's actually contained within there. Okay, awesome. Well, if we did not answer your question, please hit us up via our support team or your CSM or your account executive. We would love to have a conversation with you about your question and how we can help.
All right, and as we said at the beginning, this was recorded, so we will be sending out the link to the recording to all of the participants tomorrow, and it'll also be posted on our website. So if there's anything you want to check back on in here, you can certainly do that. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you will come to the next product webinar as well.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.